Okay, hello everybody. We are now moving into 20th century modern art. We have done 20th century modern architecture, and now we are going to move into the painting side of the art as we move into the early 1900s. All right, so real quick, I just want to do a quick review of what we mean when we're talking about modern art. Okay, so the first artists that we really saw doing anything that were considered to be modern artists were the Romanticists and the Realists. And the reason for this is the Romanticists really started to focus on painting content that was from their time. So neoclassical, if you guys remember, they would still paint about things from the past. Sometimes it could be like the semi-recent past, but they were pulling stories like the Oath of the Horatii from ancient Rome. Romanticists started to like Goya and Turner and Delacroix, like even though it wasn't necessarily realistic stuff because like liberty leading the people, but these artists, the Romanticists, were really starting to paint stuff from their time. And that was this idea of modernism, and realists and everybody from there on is going to kind of continue that. They're going to start to really focus on what is right in front of them. Now, eventually they're going to kind of be freed from having to make things look realistic, which means like, you know, with Gauguin, we saw him using color in very unrealistic ways. They weren't going for naturalism, but there was still this, you know, things of modern time, even if it meant stuff that was going on in them, just not necessarily from the past. So when we talk about modern art or modernism, just like with architecture, these guys were kind of done with the past. It's like, okay, we're moving on from art styles of the past. We're moving on from content that's from the past. We want now. And so for some artist or architect, that meant nature because that was right in front of them right now. Or it could mean modern day occurrences or events. They're also going to start using new mediums, just like architects were using new things to build with. And it won't just be oil paint. It won't just be bronze or marble for sculpture. And they were really starting to kind of be freed up to do this by artists like Gauguin and Van Gogh and Cezanne, who didn't feel like they needed to show the world perfectly naturalistic as it appeared in front of them. They could paint the real world in different ways or with different meanings. So the last movement that we talked about in the 1800s or the 19th century was the post-impressionists and the symbolists who kind of branched off of them. Like symbolists kind of blend in with post-impressionists a little bit because post-impressionists and symbolists had realized that it had been done, right? There was no other way now there was no point even in making the world look naturalistic or painting the natural world right in front of them or painting something as it actually looks because everybody has done it. Like Impressionists had basically broken it down to just color at this point. So then we start to see artists like Van Gogh, like Gauguin, like Cezanne, who were like, art does not have to be objective. It doesn't have to be a depiction of an object or a content. It can be subjective, right? It can express inner feelings. So like the way that Van Gogh saw the world, or Cezanne, how he wanted to paint, or Gauguin, who painted the natural world, like he painted people from Tahiti, but he used color in a way that was kind of freed up. Like he could do it how he wanted to. He didn't have to make the sky blue or the ground red, you know, green. He could make it how he wanted to. So 20th century art in the 1900s is going to continue on from this. And pretty much every movement that happens is just going to be a splinter off of another. And these are still going to really be located in Europe because Europe is still at this point the center of the artistic world in terms of Western art. All right. So eventually it's going to move over to America. But for now, it's very heavily rooted in Europe. And we're also going to see this influence of what Europeans considered primitive art, which I really hate because we know as art historians exactly how advanced African artists were. They could convey an idea without having to to spell it out for you. Like they could use symbolism and ideas that had greater meaning. And European artists are going to be inspired by art from Africa and Oceania and places that they considered primitive art but at the same time, we know that they were actually pretty advanced. So in the 20th century or the 1900s, there's going to be some really big events in Europe that are going to shape what people painted and how people painted and what they focused on. And so we're going to basically divide this up into pre-World War I, so before 1914, and during World War I. So basically 1900 to 1918. Then we're going to have the post-war world, which is between World War I and World War II. And then we're going to have after World War II, right? When these events are going to shake Europe to the core, and it is going to impact art because there's certain events in history that are so powerful, they impact the culture. 9/11 was one of those for America. It impacted movies, it impacted songs, it impacted everything. So these events, naturally, you can't impact people without impacting the art at the same time. And what's going to happen at the end of this is as Europe kind of gets shook by this, these terrible world wars, a lot of artists will leave Europe and come to the United States, some of them just to get away from war and some of them to escape Hitler, because Hitler was on a mission to get rid of what he called the degenerate artist, and he really despised modern art. So the first branch off of post-impressionism and symbolism that we're going to look at is the Fauvists, all right? And the Fauvists, just like every other art movement we've talked about, realism, romanticism, impressionism, post-impressionism, and symbolism, Gauguin was French. Now we're going to have the Fauvist movement branching off of it, all right? And the Fauvists would be the first ones to tell you that they were truly inspired by artworks by Gauguin, by Impressionists, by post-impressionists, symbolists even. They really liked the idea that color was powerful and that color could be free to basically, convey a particular idea, or Fauvism could even be free. Color could be free of meaning. Like symbolists used color from meaning, like Gauguin would use those reds or those blues that we saw in his works. But Fauvists are just like kids with a box of colors, and you just said, hey, kid, go have fun. All right. Paint it how you want to paint it. You can use the color for however you want to. And the name Fauvist actually means wild beasts, because people thought that the artwork of these guys looked like something wild and untamed had done it, because color wasn't tamed, all right? It was just these intense colors, very, very intense colors. That's something to kind of look at with the Fauvists, is they like very bright, very vibrant color that was freed up from having to be naturalistic. It's like we don't have to make it look exactly like the sky would look anymore. And it doesn't even have to have symbolic meaning. It can just be color for the sake of color, and making sure it's balanced and the composition looks right. So these guys do like that impressionists paint with color. They like that post-impressionists and symbolists were freed up to use color how they want to. The Fauvists just kind of like to have fun with color. All right. So here's kind of a big thing with these. Okay, so up on the left is a Fauvist painting, and on the right, the bottom right, is Cézanne, right? So basically what you have is Henri Matisse, who we're going to talk about. So Henri Matisse is a Fauvist artist. He loved to take classical Greek paintings and turn them into just color, right? He's like, I can take something from the past and do it using just color and balance it using the different colors, like the greens, and I can make complementary colors kind of pop. And I can basically take something from the past and play with it a little bit with just using color. So if Matisse would like to show things from the past that were the classical past using color, Gauguin wasn't using the classical past. He was using Tahitian girls, all right, to actually convey this idea. Matisse wasn't into that. He's like, no, I'm going to take this classical idea of, we've shown the nude in every single way we can. I'm just going to use the nude now as a way to create paintings of color. That's basically what he was going for. And there are these flat areas of color that we still see that Japanese influence really inspiring these artists. All right, so I like to tell people that the Fauvists separated color from content, all right? So, or color from description, all right? These guys just liked to use color in a way that was pretty and fun and kind of wild, all right? So yellow water, red water, pink sky, green background. Color doesn't have to depict the natural world. There's actually a really funny movie, you may have seen it, called Billy Madison. And Billy Madison is with Adam Sandler, and suddenly he decides he's going to go back to, he never graduated school, so he's going to go all the way back through the grades. And in first grade, I think it is he decides to draw a blue duck. And he's like, I drew the duck blue because I'd never seen a blue duck and I want to see a blue duck. And frankly, that's what the Fauvists were, and it's like with Gretchen and Noah, where I give them a box of crayons and I'm going, hey, color whatever you want to, however you want to, all right? The colors, you know, sometimes with the Fauvists, they wanted the colors to be next to each other because they were complementary and it was pretty, or it made another color pop and even more vibrant. And people said that these were just kids playing with a paint box, but the Fauvists had a very deliberate way to the way they put the colors together. They just weren't trying to use the colors naturally. So Fauvists were not trying to use color to create a natural three-dimensional world. They weren't. In fact, you can see a lot of the times white canvas underneath the Fauvist works of art. Like, anytime a painter lets you see the canvas underneath it, they're not trying to show you how good they can make something look natural or 3D. They're trying to make it look like, hey, I painted it this way. It's art because of the way that I painted it, not necessarily because I'm trying to make it look perfectly naturalistic as how it would look if it was right in front of you. Up there at the top, that's a self-portrait by Matisse. None of the colors actually really make a whole lot of sense. They really wanted it to be clear that they weren't trying to get perspective. They weren't trying to get depth. They're painting on a canvas. So that way you don't try to see how it almost becomes a window into a world. It's paint, and they're playing with paint and they're painting with the colors, and color is functional, not symbolic. Okay. These guys also aren't impressionists. They're not trying to show you how the natural world works, just made completely out of color. No, they're taking color and creating stuff we recognize. Like, I know that's a boat, I know that's water, but they're just freeing the color up to paint it however they wanted to. So the work of art that they picked for the 250 is Goldfish by Henri Matisse. All right, so I kind of like Matisse. I think he's fun. He's got a lot of really interesting works of art that he did. But one thing that people don't really know context-wise is everybody thinks goldfish are these very, very common fish because, I mean, now they give them away at carnivals, right? Like, it's really not that big a deal. But during this time, goldfish actually had only come into Europe from the 1800s. It's like, so they had come from countries in Asia and in Arabic countries in Africa, like Morocco. And Arabs, so people who were like, you know, in these Arabic palaces, remember, Arabs don't, if they're Islamic, don't show figures in their artwork. So they're very big into nature and kind of that idea of paradise and tranquility. That's why there's a fountain and mosques. That's why the Taj Mahal has the rivers of paradise in it. So fish were actually very common in Arabic gardens and in Arabic fountains and in the Islamic world because they were a moment to stop and reflect. Like, you would look into the water and reflect, and they were kind of peace and tranquility. And that's all great, okay, but that's really not what Matisse was going for, right? He had just seen he actually did a lot of paintings with the goldfish during, you know, his time. But what he liked was the goldfish had this beautiful color to them, all right? He's not really trying to create a natural, realistic depiction of the fish. Now, is this realism? Yeah, it's fish sitting in a bowl on a table. Is it naturalistic? No, because the table is tilted up. You can see where the different sides it's not like you're looking at just one angle at the fish. You're looking from the top, you're looking from the sides. You can see basically every view of it. And there's white on the canvas. So he's not trying, like, if you look over here in the top right, like, there's white on the canvas. He's not trying to make it look like he's painting something naturalistic. It's just capturing the colors of the fish and kind of this tranquil, peaceful, you know, area. So in the Goldfish, if you guys go back to it, he put blue and orange next to each other and red and green. So blue and orange and red and green are complementary colors. They make each other pop. They're more vibrant. And the composition itself is very balanced and it's peaceful because it's balanced. The colors make it balanced and peaceful. Just like the goldfish are kind of reflective and tranquility and stuff like that. So he's kind of almost saying that the painting is reflective and tranquil the same way that the fish are, that you can get almost that same reaction from looking at his painting and the way that he uses the color, all right? So this is something that you can see here. This is within the Islamic world of them sitting and watching the goldfish and just being embracing with nature and water and all of these things. And so that kind of feeling you would get from sitting and watching fish, which fish are very therapeutic. The nursing home that my mom is in, or the assisted living she's in, they have a lot of fish in huge fish tanks, like right in the middle of the common area. And it's very soothing, actually, for people with Alzheimer's. Like, it calms their mind, and people with memory issues. So it kind of served the same purpose. But what Matisse was wanting with the way he used color here, with the blues and the greens and the oranges, you know, all those, was to kind of give you that same tranquil experience. Now, we are going to continue on with color. So change and continuity, all right? So what stays the same and what changes between these different art movements that we see, all right? So we're going to move into the next movement, which is actually going to move into Germany, which Germany is not in the same place France is right before World War I. World War I, before World War I, France was doing great. I mean, they were good. They were a cultural art center. They were fine. Germany had just become Germany. There'd been a lot of wars that they had fought to do that. They'd made a lot of people angry, which is why they built up their military, which is why they created alliances. And basically, Germany is a big part in pushing World War I to start. Like, they were there to flick the match that kind of started the whole thing to blow up. So we have this art movement right next door to France, all right? And it would make sense, I think, in my mind, to think that Germany and France are going to clash in the way that they use colors. So if the Fauvists are French and they use color as complementary, in Expressionism in Germany, we're going to see color kind of reflect that inner turmoil that's going on in Germany, especially during World War I, all right? So what's going to continue with Expressionism as it moves into Germany is that Fauvists aren't really using color as a way to express anything. They're just kind of, it's more the form of it that's important, not really the function. But Expressionism in Germany is going to be a lot different than that, where they are going to continue using color, but in a much, much different way. So Expressionism, which begins in Germany, think of that word expressive, right? So these artists are very, very expressive, right? In similar ways that we would see Gauguin, actually. So like Gauguin is kind of considered a patron saint of these guys a little bit, all right? So you get two different splinter groups of Expressionism, all right? So you kind of have to think, here's Expressionism, and then here's two groups, two schools of thought, really. And the first one we're going to talk about is De Brücke, all right, or the bridge, which just sounds angry, all right? And De Brücke, or the bridge, these artists kind of viewed art as being the bridge to a new world. Like these guys are kind of, they're a little hostile. They almost believe that the world needs to burn down in order to rebuild. So kind of like the phoenix from the ashes. Like, these guys would have embraced World War I. They'd have been like, yeah, we really want this war to kind of burn down the old and rebuild from the ashes, all right? And that's going to really backfire on them because World War I absolutely destroyed Germany. But De Brücke was, these are conflicted, kind of angry, upset people, all right? And the artist that they picked is going to be Ernst Kirschner. And I think Kirschner is really perfect in this case. He kind of is like the founding father of the Brücke, or the bridge. He's really into the primitive side of society. And what do I mean by primitive? He means kind of like the animal nature of us, all right? And kind of how that animal nature clashes with us trying to be higher beings. So I want you to think about this for a second. Like, one of his famous subjects that he liked to do was streetwalkers or prostitutes who would, they're basically sex trafficking. They're basically sex workers, but they would be dressed up in very, very nice kind of fancy clothing, and people would be walking down streets kind of leering at them or judging them. And Kirschner kind of found that interesting because he's like, what are you trying to hide? Like, people with these clothes on and this fancy stuff that they have, they're just masking the inner primitive side of them. Like, you're hiding that. And so in looking at primitive, he was very inspired by the works of Africa, which, you know, he was like, well, that reveals the primitive side to them. Now, let me make this perfectly clear what makes him a perfect debuka or bridge person. He's very inner conflicted. And I guess because he saw so much conflict in himself, he also sees it everywhere else. Like, he's looking for it. And in Germany, on the streets of Germany, like, he did street series where he's like street Berlin, street Dresden. He was like, I just see these clashes of this modern society clashing with its primitive nature. So kind of like saying, hey, we're going to go to war, but it's for a really good reason, and we're going to kill a whole bunch of people. And he was like, okay, well, then that's World War I is good, like, at first. Like, it's us embracing our primitive side in a good way. But then he got into the war. And being in the war was not quite what he thought it was going to be. And in fact, he had such a problem with fighting in the war. And we all know how bad World War I was. That was the war to end all wars. Like, it was trench warfare. It's absolutely terrible. So many people died of terrible injuries that people had never seen before. But he ended up being an ambulance driver because I guess he thought that would be easier. But it's not, because then you're just basically going in and picking up the dead and seeing all this carnage, and you're right in the middle of seeing the aftermath of it. And he was discharged from the military because he had a mental breakdown. He had lung disease from smoking so much, abusing substances, but he gets out of the war, and we see him with his art. Like, he was a painter of nudes primarily before the war. And then after the war, he gets very, very dark, and his style of expressiveness is the way he uses color is very different from the Fauvists because he's expressing a view through color. Now, this is very different from things like Goya and Turner, who the color adds to it, but it's natural, so they can kind of convey it this way. This guy is like, no, I'm going to use color to express this view, all right? So these are actually some works of art by Kirschner, and you can see that he uses that angular style of the geometric masks. All right, so they're very geometric, and the eyes are often hollow, whereas African masks, the eyes would be closed and kind of like downcast and humble. This is not that. All right, this is their eyes are open and almost staring, but like lacking, like they don't really see. I mean, it's just crazy. Like, we wear these primitive masks. Like, so we put on these masks to hide the true primitive side of us. But we're really just these primitive beasts underneath, and look at the carnage that we create, like with the World War, right? So he really likes, again, what I call the primitive. He had seen in the war that there were these primitive forces under. So if war was civilized, then what were we doing with this war? Because he saw it firsthand. He's like, this is not civilized. There's some very primitive forces. If you guys have ever taken psych, basically he's obsessed with the id. All right, he paints the id covered up by the super ego. Like, really, it's just we're so judgmental and we're all of these things, but really we're just hiding our inner primitive forces. And he viewed that art was a way to keep those primitive powers in check. He's like, I'm using art to convey that, to kind of show how primitive we are, that we say we're so advanced with all our machinery and our debating and all that stuff, but really we're just animals killing each other. So here he is, you know, inspired by primitive art. Now, his ideas really clashed with the Nazis, all right, because the Nazis have this entire belief that in Germany, the Germans are supreme beings. Like, they are the ultimate upper class. And here was this guy who's painting primitive people covered up with masks and basically saying that humans are really just degenerates covering it up with a mask. And, you know, he's like, yeah. And so eventually he was labeled a degenerate by the Nazi party and committed suicide because of it. So the piece that they picked for the 250 for Kirschner is his self-portrait as a soldier, right? Very, very powerful piece. And you can see in his face, this self-portrait, he is showing himself with those African style features, like very angular. And even the way that he paints the body of the nude behind him, which is a painting, may also have been a muse, right? So maybe a muse that he can no longer see because it's behind him, because he used to paint nudes, all right? Here's what he said, and then I'll go into some of the details of this. We believe in development. He's talking about De Bruyne, right? The bridge. We believe in development and in generation of people who are both creative and appreciative. We call together all young people, and as young people who bear the future, we want to acquire freedom for our hands and lives against the well-established older forces, all right? Everyone belongs to us who renders in an immediate and unfalsified way everything that compels him to be creative. So basically, they're all embracing their creative side as a way of letting that primitive out, and then that could kind of keep it in check. So this painting was actually done when he was recovering from his time in the war as an ambulance driver, which was short because he kind of had a mental breakdown. And in this, he's got a nude painted behind him, which has that, again, African, very angular, geometric shape to it. And that's what he used to paint. But he also shows himself with an injury with his hand cut off, missing a hand. Kind of like Van Gogh showed a self-portrait of himself with his ear bandaged, because he's like, you know, I also injured myself, all right, because of this. And either by enlisting in the war or self-injury or whatever. So he can no longer paint what he used to. And basically it's like the war has injured him physically, so he can't paint, but mentally he can't paint nudes anymore. And the blank eyes, like emotionless, like basically these masks kind of cover up the inner primitive side of us. And he uses colors that clash with each other, that are meant to be jarring, that are meant to be disturbing. And he's showing himself in his military uniform and basically a cigarette hanging out of his mouth, and like basically, you know, how his life has been destroyed because of this. Very different from how we have seen other artists showing themselves as painters. Okay, so if we have, remember we said in Expressionism in Germany, we have this continuation of color from Fauvism, all right? So that continues on. What's going to change is the way that they use color, all right? So if Fauvists are all about color that is complementary and kind of creates a good form and composition, Expressionists who are of De Bruyne or the bridge are going to be, yeah, we're going to use color, but we're going to use it expressively to show conflict, to make it clash, to make it, you know, express an idea, all right? Then there's going to be the other side of this, all right? So there's the Brücke on one side, and then there is the Blue Rider, all right, which is another branch off of Expressionism in Germany. The Blue Rider is the complete opposite, all right? They still use color, but they're really not making it as angry. All right, these guys just really like to use color almost symbolically. All right, and I'll explain. All right, so the artist that they chose for this is Vasily Kandinsky. All right, and Kandinsky is an incredible human being in terms of the art that he did. All right, this is kind of a huge step in art from moving away from objects that look like anything and works of art that are made just purely from color and form. All right, it doesn't look like anything, right? It just is color and form. And Vasily Kandinsky is actually really interesting. He's also another one that's going to get kicked out of Germany, all right, who really likes Bauhaus architecture, which is why I wanted to do architecture first. He, in Germany, likes that idea of clean lines and geometric shapes. However, he's a little bit different because he really likes color, which we know Bauhaus does not. The way that Kandinsky saw art is almost like art was like music, that it could be composed and put together with louder, softer, there's movement, there's sometimes where there's lots of notes, sometimes where there's not. And he saw that there's this power to just color that can express an idea. Like we even describe emotions as, I'm feeling blue or I'm tickled pink. And he actually had synesthesia where he could see sound and it appeared in color. So he believes that his works of art are like sound, which you can't actually see, but it could still impact people. So just because you can't see the sound of it doesn't mean it can't impact you. So he was like, I don't need to actually paint something that looks like something for it to impact people. Colors can actually do that, freed up from, being confined to the body of an image. So let me see if I can get this to play, actually. So this is Wagner.
In this art history video, we'll dive into the world of Wassily Kandinsky. We'll take a look at how Impressionism influenced his early work and how the Bauhaus art movement influenced his later work. We'll also take a look at some of his woodblock prints that we'll use as inspiration for printmaking in our next art project. Kandinsky was one of the leaders of the Blue Rider group of abstract expressionist artists in Germany from 1911 until 1914 when World War I broke out. During World War I, Kandinsky had to leave Germany and return to his home country, Russia, where he would stay until 1921. Now, Kandinsky had grown up in Russia and previously been trained as a musician, and earlier in his life had pursued a career as a teacher in law and economics. It wasn't until the age of 30 that he gave up this career to become an artist. So what influenced Kandinsky to leave this promising teaching career to try something new, to become an artist? Claude Monet in his paintings of haystacks. Kandinsky was struck by how Monet's haystacks had a fairy tale power and splendor. He felt surprised and confused by the painting, because he could only see an impression rather than a realistic image of a haystack. In fact, the art movement that Monet led was called French Impressionism. What was Impressionism, and why was it so impactful? Not just on Kandinsky, but other painters and also different types of artists, including musicians and even writers. The Impressionists were a group of artists who came onto the scene in Paris in the 1860s. And just like the Blue Riders, the Impressionists were disruptors. They didn't want to paint in traditional ways. They wanted to change the way art was made, even if it meant shocking audiences. They painted in open air instead of inside a classroom, with quick brushstrokes and bright colors. They shocked audiences because their work was made in an untraditional way and looked incomplete. It would have been hard to imagine then that the Impressionist art would be so valuable today. But Kandinsky was mesmerized by Monet's work and ready to apply his own creative concepts to art. Kandinsky explored color, materials, and concepts to innovate new ways of making art. Early on, he used a technique called woodblock printing. Woodblock prints left an impression of the etching on paper, in which you could almost see the grains of wood that he used as part of the process to print. Kandinsky also later painted with oil paints and intense colors. He believed that color was more than just an adjective. It was an object with its own meaning, depth, and purpose. It's even believed that he had synesthesia, which allowed him to see colors when he listened to music. Kandinsky listened to music before or while he painted, and titled many of his works with musical titles, like composition. He once described his unusual sensibility while he was watching an opera performance in Moscow. I saw all my colors in spirit before my eyes. Wild, almost crazy lines were sketched in front of me. In 1921, after spending 7 years in Russia, Kandinsky was ready to try something new. He left Russia once again to live in Germany. There, he taught at the Bauhaus Art School and would develop a new, more minimal way of making art. His work became more geometric in design, and shapes as well as colors began to take on symbolic meaning. In On White too, Kandinsky listened to music while he was painting. For Kandinsky, white represented the endless possibilities available in life. In black, its non-existence and death. Black slices through the white in the painting, much like death can interrupt opportunities in life. But what else was going on at the time when Kandinsky was in Germany in the 1930s? In 1933, the Nazi political party took over Germany and was soon led by the dictator Adolf Hitler. This took a heavy toll on all aspects of life in Germany. The Nazis suppressed any political, religious, or social ideas that competed with their ideology, and they quickly closed down the Bauhaus School of Art. The Nazis shunned ideas of free expression and innovation, and they labeled artwork that didn't adhere to the Nazi socialist ideals of beauty as degenerate. Kandinsky would have to leave Germany once again. His art was banned, and some of his works even destroyed by the Nazis. As World War II erupted in 1939, there was upheaval and chaos throughout Europe as the Nazis vied for power. Kandinsky took refuge in France, where he continued to make art up until the last years of his life. While he would die in 1944, just 1 year before the end of World War II, many of Kandinsky's works survived the turmoil of the war. Kandinsky's work has inspired artists for decades and continues to inspire us to make our own art. Now, let's take what we've learned about Vasily Kandinsky and make our own art.
Okay, so when they said on here that Kandinsky viewed color as the object, that is what is important about him. All right, so it's just kind of a continuation of these artists who were using color to color objects in a certain way to convey something. So like, Kirschner uses clashing colors in his objects, and Fauvists use complementary colors in their objects. But Kandinsky was like, no, color is the object. It is the subject, right? And it can stand on its own. So what he was trying to say, and what the Blue Rider was trying to say, is that just because there isn't a subject doesn't mean there isn't meaning. They talk about the white background being endless possibility, and black being, the possibility of death and destruction that slashes through that. So what we start to see is the creation of abstract art. Abstract does not look like anything in particular, right? It is just made up of forms and colors, and the form is the art and not the content. All right, it's not the focus of what they're painting anymore. It's more how they're painting it. So let's see here. I like this quote by Kandinsky. Color is the keyboard, the eye is the hammer, meaning like on the piano, the hammer that hammers the keys. The soul is the piano with its many strings. The artist is the hand that purposely sets the soul by vibrating by means of this or that key. So you guys kind of get the point. All right, so this is the work that they have chosen for the 250. And believe it or not, there are actually some, according to, Kandinsky, there are some images in here, right? But you'll see here that this is a really good example of that start of abstract expressionism, right? They're expressing an idea, they're expressing a concept, and they're using color and shape and line to do it without the need for there to be a specific clear object. All right, we're moving away from there being an object that they're painting to color being the object. And this is called Improvisation 28. All right, because an improv is like, basically jazz musicians can improvise. They can just put together music really quickly, or actors can improvise really quickly. But improvisation is actually a musical term, all right? And this work of art, you've got the white background, so the white of possibility, right? Again, supposedly it captures a horse and a rider. And where I see it is up here at the top. Like if you can see where my mouse is, like those are the little ears of the horse. And then here's the bridle and its mouth. And then the reins kind of come down here. And then the person on the back is just completely comprised of color. So it's that idea of the horse and the rider, which is kind of like a crusader, like a knight. All right, so like somebody who's charging into battle against conventional art or what is traditional, like they're charging in to challenge that and to challenge ideas of the time. So he kind of believes that music can influence you without there being a clear, visible subject. Like you can't actually see the music, but you can still feel it. So this is, okay, you can feel it without actually having to see the images. They're there. It may just be very tough to see. So sometimes the colors can be chords that can go together. Like a chord in music is notes that go together to make either a really pretty sound or a really ugly sound. So sometimes they can clash and be like a really ominous, ugly noise, like somebody's going bang, like on a piano, or they can go together and they can be kind of soothing and like complement each other. So it can show unity, it can show discord, like, ugliness and, clashing. So he liked to kind of symbolize that there were, cataclysmic, there were bad events, and then there was celebration. So if you notice that over here on the left, this was supposed to look like a wave coming crashing in. So like this big wave of cataclysm. So like you can see like the water here, like here comes the wave. But then after it's all over, it's better. And you've got a couple over here embracing on the right or kissing in a way and celebrating in candlelight, which some of you guys may be like, Schoenhorn, you have completely gone off the deep end because you've been home too long. No, I'm serious. All right, I can kind of see it. But even Kandinsky's like, it doesn't really even matter if you can see it. It's the idea of how it makes you feel. And you can feel something without actually seeing the object. All right. So we are going to stop there and we will pick up with more expressionism in Germany with our next piece.